On the point of view, we get the right guests, ask them the right questions on issues that matter to you. We have a big one today. The man I'm about to interview has worked with this international organization for over 3 decades, shaping policies that have influenced millions of lives. We caught up with him at the sidelines of a program here in Accra on his reflections on globalization, Africa, Ghana, and the future. Stay with us.
Abebe Selassie is the director of the African Department, a position he has held since 2016. In this capacity, he oversees the IMF's work with 45 countries across sub-Saharan Africa. Abebe and his team work closely with the region's leaders and policymakers to improve economic and development outcomes. This includes oversight of the IMF's intensified engagement with the region in recent years, including some $60 billion in financial support the institution has provided to countries since 2020. Before being appointed director in 2016, Mr. Selassie gained extensive experience in a wide-ranging career at the IMF. He held various senior positions, including deputy director in the African Department, mission chief for Portugal during the Euro area crisis, and South Africa. He has served as the IMF senior resident representative in Uganda, and earlier in his career, he worked on the fund's lending programs with Turkey, Thailand, Romania, and Estonia. While in the Strategy, Policy and Review Department, he was deeply involved in the IMF program and adjustment policy design issues. Before joining the IMF in 1994, he worked for the government of Ethiopia as a principal economist in the Office of the President and at the Economist Intelligence Unit in London. Abebe did his graduate studies at the London School of Economics.
So the man has been working with the IMF for 32 years, and we're happy to talk to him. Abebe, thank you so much.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you for having me.
So this is 94 since you joined the fund?
Yes, late 94.
Wow. So how many times would you have come to Ghana within that period?
You know, I don't know, total maybe about 8, 9 times, maybe a bit more. I've never really worked with the Ghana country team directly, but over the years I've had incredible opportunity to come here, including starting before I joined the IMF. I was working for my government.
Okay.
So I think maybe 92, late 92, 90, and
Wow.
I think most likely 93. I came to study a little bit how your reforms in the FX market had proceeded and to try and adapt lessons.
Even then?
Back then.
Wow.
So really, so I have, you know, these data points, you know, from the early 90s, having been here, also of course Addis and Kampala and Harare.
And it's been 10 years in this role.
Yes, as director of the African Department of the IMF.
What does that actually entail?
So, you know, what basically that means is that I have the great privilege of working with the 45 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We provide support to countries and basically through three different ways. First and foremost, of course, and one which doesn't get a lot of limelight, honestly, is capacity development. So we do a lot of technical work across the region where we provide input into governments' deliberations and preparation of policies. So, you know, this is stuff that never sees the light of day. But, you know, for example, you know, with central banks, we help work with them in terms of how to deepen monetary money markets, how to make sure that FX markets function better. With tax authorities, you know, what is the optimal way of setting up your tax collection framework? What are the kind of optimal policies? And we do all of this by bringing experts and you know, explaining what works best, what has worked best for either similarly situated countries or more advanced countries. So, you know, a lot of capacity building in this vein. So that's the first avenue. Second is we have something called kind of surveillance discussions around the world. An important mandate of the IMF is to make sure that the direction of policies in all countries around the world is one which is doesn't lead to spillovers, to externalities, as we would call them, that have a negative impact on other countries, that the direction of policies are broadly the right one. So we have those kind of discussions with all 45 members of the IMF from sub-Saharan Africa. And then the last but not least is that we of course, provide financing when countries are in severe difficulty, whether it's in the context of shocks or the periods where there are macroeconomic imbalances. That is the one that's
that's what we talk about a lot more.
Yeah, exactly. That's what captures the public's imagination.
Yeah.
And that's also a really incredibly important way in which we try and provide support for countries.
A lot of the conversation will be focused on that, but I'm intrigued by the second point around the surveillance and the policy spillovers, because one would think that a lot of the countries in SSA are too small to really have a dent on the global economy, and that type of thing needs to happen with the bigger countries because
we do. No,
so, do you do work in these countries too?
Yeah, no. So this surveillance work that we do is all 191 members of the IMF, and that is actually, I would say, kind of the lion's share of the IMF's time is both on bilateral, the institution with the countries and reporting on that to the rest of the world, but also multilateral surveillance. So I would argue that we are the premier institution.
But is that work
in terms of assessing how, in aggregate, the global economy is functioning, where the pressure points are, what can be done best by countries to make sure that those pressure points are alleviated, all with a view to making sure that you have better global growth, higher quality global growth that is beneficial to.
But is that work in the global context diagnostic or prescriptive?
Both, I would say.
So you're able to say, for example, that trade war is not good for the world, therefore don't do it.
Right? I mean,
would they listen to you?
I think you underestimate we have one of the great things about our institution is we have really great convening power. I would argue that in many of the important issues of the day, global imbalances, for example, AI, what effect it could have on labor force issues, dynamics going forward. These are all kind of things that we weigh in on. We have leading experts on this, and also ministers come, finance ministers, twice a year in Washington at the spring meetings, at the annual meetings, and fairly intense discussions are had. We provide extensive support to other global configurations, G20, G7. We provide input into their deliberations, particularly in this area of global cooperation, fiscal policy, of monetary policy, and we have, again, also kind of all other kinds of fora with whom we used to meet with central bankers and others. And I think leaders across the world value the fact that they can sit with their peer groups and discuss some of these issues. Resolution is not always easy, but at least discussions. We facilitate a lot of discussions and put forward a lot of ideas.
This conversation is happening within a very interesting context. Yesterday, the Canadian Prime Minister spoke at the World Economic Forum. He says, we have to be honest. The rule-based order we've assumed is now fiction. There's a new reality. And he described his country as a middle power that needs to form new alliances. There are two questions in there. How seriously dented is what we know? Is it in transition or it's basically ended? And number two, what does that mean for the relevance of multilateral institutions like yours? Because of course there's a UN, the WTO, but I think the World Bank and the IMF are also extensions of that. So it's a two-in-one.
Okay, so big questions that we could go on.
Of course, he's a central banker himself as well. So don't forget that. He was speaking as a former central banker and now Canadian Prime Minister.
Okay. So, I want to perhaps relate these questions to how it impacts sub-Saharan Africa, or at least the perspective I see it in. So I think the first thing to note is, yes, absolutely, this is a period of great disruption, great change, and we have to, accept that it's happening. And so, at the same time, I think it's important to contextualize. Contextualize in what way? It's not as if the global economy or my institution has not gone through periods of huge changes, seismic changes even. Some are related to crises, global financial crises. For example, COVID, of course, crisis that we're just coming through. Those also had huge consequences in terms of well-being of people, the global configurations. But, and but also like in a historical context, for example, coming to the IMF, until we only became a universal membership organization after the fall of the Iron Curtain. Before that, all of the countries in the Soviet Union bloc were not even members of the IMF. China's membership to the IMF only happened in the 1980s. So, I think we also have to accept that, over a period, longer term periods, there have been these periods of rapture and reconfiguration and adaptability by international organizations to play a role that global governments are asking. Now, drilling down a bit further, for African countries, I think what is happening around the world at some level is also not new. I think the positioning of many of our countries has always been, as part of what in the old days we used to call the non-aligned movement. I think the lion's share of our countries were seeing that it was important to have multiple trade partners, multiple allies, and have stuck with that approach. So I think that I see needing to continue to persist. So there's been both diversification of financial relationships, trade relationships that Africa has had. We used to be with Europe, we used to, a lot more. Now it's as much with China, other Asian countries, emerging powers in the Middle East, etc. And so I think most of our countries are relatively well positioned by having a diverse set of partners. And I think this needs to be maintained going forward. So I think there's also some strength or some positioning that has happened by our countries that is probably somewhat less challenging than for other countries that are only now beginning to face it. When it comes to international organizations, as I said, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, one is that it's not as if the IMF has its, we are a membership organization, so the work we do, the mandate that we have, comes from all of our members, 191 members. There have been periods where, of course, countries have been looking inwards to address things, not enough mindful of the fact that what they are doing is not helping global well-being. So that's exactly, and in fact, it's this 1930s period of global depression, bigger than ever devaluations, which gave rise to the need for institutions like the Bretton Woods institutions, yes. IMF and World Bank. And I think over the years, that system has also not been stable. It's been changing over time. So there was a big change, for example, in the late 60s, early 70s, when countries came off the dollar peg. It led to a whole rewiring of how monetary and fiscal policies are conducted. We got new mandates, new responsibilities. We stepped up to that. So we are an institution that will always be there to help countries to do what countries ask us to do. And so in that vein, I think one thing I can certainly say is that the need for entities that facilitate the conversations we're talking about, if anything, is greater now than ever.
This is the point of view. We're speaking to the Director for Africa for IMF, Abebe Amro Selassie. He's been with the fund for many years. He's done this job in this role for 10 years, and in May he will hang up his boots. Reflections on many things. So 10 years overseeing the fund's work in over 42, 43, 44 countries. A couple of points there. How would you know if you've done well? Let me give the context for this. I was reading the Global Economic Prospects Report, World Bank Group. I think this is 23, 24. Global growth has unmistakably slowed down and has unmistakably downshifted to a slower gear since the pandemic. Is now at a pace insufficient to reduce extreme poverty and create jobs where they are needed most. If the forecast in the latest edition of the World Bank Group's Global Economic Prospects materialize, the average growth rate of this decade will be the lowest since the 1960s. It goes on. That depressing statistic hides an even more disconcerting detail. While nearly all advanced economies will be richer in per capita income than they were before the pandemic, 1 out of 4 developing countries and more than a third of all low-income economies will be poorer than they were 5 years ago. This is absolutely damning. How do you interpret such a report in view of the fact that, of the work you've been trying to do in these countries over the past 10 years?
So, I think the first point to make is that there is more heterogeneity, there's more differentiation in terms of economic trajectories in Africa than probably around the world. Second, one thing that I've been at pains to draw attention to is the fact that you have this very, very diverse set of countries in the region and diverse economic developments across the region, and I really always kind of worry when we are trying to lump a continent as diverse as this into a single data point, a single figure. Okay. Second, this last 4 or 5 years in particular have been incredibly difficult period because of all of the things that have been going on around the world. But it's important also to recognize that the decade before, more or less, was one where there was also like incredible optimism. Right? I mean, 2015, 16, we're talking about Africa rising, right? And all of the progress that countries were making, there was just no end in sight to that, right? So I think it's also like how we see the context, including the near term, like the next 5 years, etc., sometimes tends to be weighted and influenced by the most recent data point, the most recent period, and so colors what is possible. Again, for me, kind of, the point I would come back to is that, look, over the last 30 years, we have made tremendous progress. And I don't mean like in how the cityscape in Accra has changed, but fundamental progress where there's been incredible improvement in human capital outcomes. Other development indicators, which I always like to look at when I visit countries, things like, infant mortality rates, maternal mortality rates, they've changed faster than happened than in other faster growing countries around the world. The adoption of technology, this phenomenal improvement. And in 1992, if you had asked me if any of this would be possible when I was working for my government or soon after I joined the IMF, I would have been very skeptical. I would have been very skeptical, and look where we are. So going forward, I think what we need to do is, and what, in terms of kind of how we can best position countries, is to realize that a lot of the weakness in macroeconomic outcomes we have seen in recent years have been on account of really terrible external environment, the external shocks that have affected our countries, starting with the pandemic, starting with the war in Ukraine, which had huge, which gave rise to a huge increase in cost of living crisis, the disruption in capital flows, which also increase the cost of financing that our countries are facing. But these are not permanent things. And not only that, but we see a lot of resilience. Countries have gone through very difficult patches, but we've calibrated, we've adjusted, and positions ourselves to recover well. So the question for me is like, what do we do now to make sure that we can go back to the Africa rising years? And I think I see a lot of resilience in the region. I see a lot of hope, and provided policies continue to be in the right direction, we can do even better than we have. Exactly because fundamentals are so much stronger than they were 30 years ago. Lastly, in terms of the role of the IMF, we are, as I said, we have this regular engagement with countries and do tremendous work, as I said, helping strengthen institutions that conduct macroeconomic policy. Like, as I said, revenue authorities, monetary authorities, etc. But it's when crises like this affect the region, affect our countries, that we come to the fore. That's what the world expects of us, and I would argue that we have stepped forward for Africa like never before in our history. Since 2020, March 2020, when the pandemic was declared, we have provided to the tune of about $70 billion in financing for sub-Saharan Africa. That is, multiple um, times what we used to provide before. And this was needed. Why? Because our countries were facing some of the most difficult period ever, and so we've tried to cushion the blow, even as others. Financial markets, donor flows have been declining. We're the ones that have stepped forward, providing all of this financing to cushion the effect of these global shocks. So I think I think we've done.
Well, you can't be a judge in your own court, but what people can say is that because you are very influential in particularly smaller, weaker economies, I'm not saying we can blame you, but you ought to take a bit more responsibility. For example, people talk about debt and how countries were encouraged to go to the international capital markets to accrue debts that, frankly, at some level were very, very unfavorable. And some of that was sort of portrayed as his progress, right? You've built enough buffers to go and borrow from the Eurobond market, for example. Led to debt distress in many countries, and now there's a pushback. Some people feel the fund should take more responsibility in not be more proactive in the way to raise the red flag around those. Because I remember when Setekbe and Ken Ofori-Atta and co were going to the bond market, it sounded like great news. We're on a road show, hey, we are getting nice spreads. It seemed so fun, right? Of course, they took the decisions. But there's a sense in which people feel the fund could have done a bit more to warn of those dangers. Now that things have gone south, of course, so hindsight is clear, right?
No, but you raise a really important and interesting point. So how I see my first, I think Kenya was the first country I visited after I was appointed director in 2016, and in a very the visit was really interesting because not only did I meet the country authorities, but also went to parliament, met with civil society organizations, and it gave me kind of really a nice summary shot of what I was seeing in other countries also. So what do I mean by this? So what struck me was that we at the IMF are of course always we're always accused of promoting austerity, always asking countries to reduce the fiscal deficit, and nobody quite relates lower fiscal deficits to the fact that that means lower debt, right? So we tend to be conservative and always tend to see more dangers from loose fiscal policies than perhaps most country authorities. But because that's exactly, we're there to warn about risks. Huh? So I was there making the case for, fiscal restraint. Mm-hmm. And the minister, also could see the reason for, the case for that. I then went to Parliament, and it was really striking in that the pressure for the government to spend more to address all of the incredible development needs that we have, to build more universities, more hospitals, more infrastructure, complete the standard gauge railway and extend it to Kampala. I mean, the pressure was just immense. And then, we go to civil society, and civil society organizations were worried about debt also. We're borrowing too much, the debt level has gone up, And what struck me was that, many of our ministers, governments, presidents, our society in general is caught in this something, I called the fiscal trilemma. So, there's pressure to continue to spend. Mm-hmm. By the way, the parliamentarians did not see the case for increasing tax revenues. Not at all.
They just wanted more.
They just wanted the spending. Okay, and the president, despite the majority in parliament, the minister was facing huge pressure in his inability to increase taxes. So this trilemma, this image that came to me was like, nobody wants tax increases, and civil society was not for tax increases either. Nobody wants tax increases.
Just spend more. Don't.
Everybody wants more spending, and nobody wants any debt. Okay, and I wrote up a small piece about that and have been using this framework to discuss issues in countries which were facing this. And I think this is not unique to Africa either, honestly.
Okay.
I mean, this is in other emerging market countries, but even more so in advanced countries. I mean, you see a lot of the discussions on budget formulation in France or other countries right now. And, you know, so I think what I would argue about, you know, our role in this is that, look, the level of taxation, the composition of spending are deeply domestic and deeply political debates that are to be had within countries. What we do is try and explain kind of, you know, what the pitfalls of you know, perhaps pushing the balance between spending and debt sustainability a bit too much in, you know, an aggressive direction could be, etc. And I can assure you that I mean, you can call Seth or other ministers, and I don't think that we will find any of them having faced advice from us that, you know, the right thing to do is go out and.
But did you warn them?
More.
Did you warn them about the risks in, particularly the international capital markets, because that type of funding became available when we became on paper a so-called middle income country.
So this is really important also. You know, I think I also worry a little bit about, you know, like all this glitz and excitement that we have about Eurobonds.
Good.
When the government is issuing domestic bonds.
Nobody does.
We don't raise an eyebrow. And I mean, there's really fundamentally really important reasons, because you're borrowing in your own currency, and by and large, provided you're prudent, that's okay. But every time there's a Eurobond issuance, kind of, you know, all the hype is crazy. So what we do is, like, we try and take a comprehensive assessment of policies and the financing related to those policies. And so this is exactly where, like, the work we do on debt sustainability comes in, for example. So I think Ghana, going back as far as 2014 or so, has been categorized as high risk of debt distress. So we identify the level of debt vulnerability, and we've been flagging that since then. And, you know, it's not also policy missteps, though, that led to Ghana being where it is. You know, although that, I would say, is, you know, in country after, you know, as you zoom out and think about why it is debt difficulties have arisen, in some cases it's policies, but external environment and the change in external environment has also contributed. There's nobody out there that will tell you that the IMF has been for going out and borrowing. If anything, we've been making the case the other way around. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, the decisions, of course, are fundamentally sovereign decision.
We're speaking to the Director of the Africa Department for the IMF, Abebe Selassie, and we're reflecting on a number of things. When we come back, we'll talk a bit more about the Ghana situation. We have, of course, just had the 5th review of our extended credit facility. Almost all the $3 billion has been given to us. What's the outlook for that, right? And what are his own reflections on how economic policy management should work going forward, having worked for the fund for many, many years? This is the point of view. Stay with us.